We are talking today with Naomi Wolf. Naomi Wolf's essays have appeared in numerous publications, including The New Republic, The Wall Street Journal, Glamour, Ms., Esquire, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. She is also the author of numerous books, including the international bestseller The Beauty Myth, Fire with Fire, The New Female Power and How It Will Change the 21st Century, Promiscuities, The Secret Struggle for Womanhood, The Treehouse, Eccentric Wisdom from My Father on How to Live, Love, and See. And she is here to talk about her new book, The End of America, Letter of Warning to a Young Patriot. Start out and tell us, what was the motivation in writing The End of America?
Well, I have a friend who is slightly older, and she is the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she kept saying when we were talking about news events, they did this in Germany, they did this in Germany. And I thought she was really way being hyperbolic and extreme. And I really tried to brush it off, but she was very insistent. And finally, she sat me down and gave me a stack of history books and said, start reading. And when I started to read, she wasn't talking about the later years, National Socialist outcomes. She was talking about the early years when Germany in 1930, 31, 32 would have looked pretty familiar to us. It was a parliamentary democracy with political parties, newspapers, celebrities, fashion, human rights organizations, gay rights organizations, sex education organizations, you know, a modern state. And she was talking about, and I saw these incredible parallels in how the National Socialists legally exerted various pressures on democracy to begin to close down democracy. And then I started reading about other times and places where a would-be despot has sought to close down an open society or crush a democracy movement. And I read about Italy in the 20s. Mussolini was always the innovator. I mentioned Germany in the 30s, Russia in the 30s, East Germany in the 50s, Czechoslovakia in the 60s, Pinochet's coup in Chile in 1973, and China's crackdown against democracy activists in the end of the 80s. And Mike, what became so clear is that all would-be despots do the same 10 things. There's like this blueprint for closing down a democracy. And it's not complex, and it doesn't matter if they're on the left or the right. They all take the same 10 steps. Mussolini was the innovator. Hitler studied Mussolini. Stalin studied Hitler. Hitler studied Stalin. The great dictators kind of perfected the blueprint, and then petty dictators subsequently. You know, we basically teach the blueprint at the School for the Americas, and Latin American dictators emulate the blueprint. In Thailand, they use the blueprint. In Burma, they're using the, you know, everywhere you look. So then what became super obvious as I read is that these same 10 steps are underway in the United States right now. And the final reason I wrote this book is that I also have a younger friend, a 28-year-old young patriot of the subtitle, Chris Lee, who was marrying a young woman, Jennifer Gandon, whom I mentor. And I realized that, you know, with these storm clouds gathering, I really needed to give them not just a primer on how societies closed down, but also a quick refresher in what democracy is, what the founders intended, and how we can sustain it. And that's why I wrote the book.
So you started with these papers and such that your friend had given you. Did you find that all pretty mind-blowing to discover that?
Oh, it's beyond mind-blowing. I mean, I think readers of this book are as shocked as I was. You know, it's one thing to broadly notice tactics, and you know, the tactics that are being reproduced now from Germany in 1930, 31, 32 are extraordinarily similar. I mean, everything from, you know, the National Socialists invoked a terror threat, and, you know, the parliamentarians didn't want to be seen as unpatriotic, so they passed something called the Enabling Acts, which basically said, okay, you can listen in on Germans' phone calls, you can open their mail, you can, you know, let's crack down on, you know, free assembly. You know, all the way to phrases like homeland, you know. There are these tiny little fingerprints that are recurring, so that it seems like someone didn't just go back and look at the big pressures, but they actually looked at the history of dictatorships and sort of chose the greatest hits and recycled them in terms of like metaphors, language, sound bites. I mean, Goebbels pioneered the embedding of journalists, and the National Socialists unloaded coffins at night of the war dead. We unload coffins at night. The National Socialists. You should look at the clip of Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which shows Hitler descending through the clouds in an airplane, being greeted by uniformed, right? And he talks about let us accomplish our mission with, of course, mission accomplished. It's eerie, it's scary, but these are just like freak out moments. I mean, I kept having this feeling of deja vu, like, okay, there are these spontaneous gatherings throughout the South where people burn Dixie Chicks CDs. Okay, that seems familiar. And, CDs don't really burn, right? I mean, that takes some doing. And, of course, Goebbels in 1933 in April organized, quote-unquote, spontaneous uprisings of students to burn books. These echoes are extraordinary, but what is really scary is the big echoes of these 10 steps that they all pursue.
Well, maybe you can go into those. Of course, we only have a limited time, but talk about the individual steps and what you see happening now. Yeah,
I'll just talk about the first 4, because that's bad enough. So the first thing a would-be despot always does, and by the way, this is an argument very much in the true American grain, because if you look at what the founders of our country were doing when they wrote the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, they wrote those documents. I didn't realize this till I went back and read the Federalist Papers. They wrote those documents in a state of fear. It wasn't this confident Hallmark card kind of yippee, freedom. They were terrified, and they were terrified because they understood tyranny. And whether it was King George sentencing Thomas Paine for hanging for writing The Rights of Man, or people torturing the Quakers for their religious beliefs, and they knew absolutely without a doubt something we've forgotten. They categorically knew that a despot, an American despot, could easily arise in America to oppress Americans. And that's why they set up our system as they did, of checks and balances. And they totally believed and understood that human nature is to abuse power if power is unchecked. And that's why they gave us, for instance, the Second Amendment that keeps us from having standing armies that menace citizens. They gave us the Fourth Amendment that keeps us safe in our homes, safe from people breaking in, agents of the state breaking in and taking our stuff, as they did with Brandon Mayfield in Oregon. So the 10 steps, are exactly what the founders set up our system to avoid. The first thing would-be despots do is they invoke an internal and external threat. And often it's a real threat that they will hype. Stalin talked about sleeper cells. Now, that's a term we hadn't heard before the Bush administration. Stalin's alleged sleeper cells were capitalist terrorists, us, right, who were supposed to dress like good Soviet citizens and hide among the population of good Soviet citizens for years until at a signal they would rise up and create capitalist terrorist mayhem. So this was a fake threat, but it terrified Soviet citizens and ushered in the terror of 1937. But Pinochet invoked a real threat. He told Chileans about armed insurgents, and there were armed insurgents. But then he used fake documents, and now we saw fake documents with the Yellow Cake, Niger, uranium purchase fake documents that drove us into this bloody war. And he said, they're all going to, purported to show a terrorist plot where they were going to bomb the infrastructure and assassinate military leaders. And this flipped people out so bad that they didn't defend their democracy very aggressively when the coup took place. The second thing a would-be despot always does is that they create a secret prison system where torture takes place outside the rule of law. And usually they will also create military tribunals that strip prisoners of due process. Again, Lenin innovated this. Mussolini had his own version with confino, is what he called it. It's always Stalin studied Mussolini, Hitler studied Stalin. Hitler created the people's courts. And this was when there was still a practicing civil judiciary. What they do is they create a system that bypasses a parallel secret prison system. Now, why should we worry about that? First of all, I ask you and your listeners, and this is a challenge I've issued now for almost a month, and no one has. I should offer $50,000, even though I can't easily raise it, as an incentive, because nobody has been able to answer this question. name a society that creates a secret prison system outside of the rule of law where torture takes place that doesn't sooner or later start abusing its own civil leaders. And so why we should worry about Guantanamo, apart from the moral issue, we should worry for our own sakes, because what you see in what I call a fascist shift, and I use that term technically, is that the state will start by torturing or abusing people that no one really identifies with. Brown people, Muslims, whatever, right? In Germany, anarchists, communists, Jews, homosexuals, labor leaders, whatever. But that very soon there's this blurring of the line, and more civil people at the heart of mainstream society start to get caught up in the dragnet and abused. So we should worry because the president has declared that he has the power to say, Mike, you're an enemy combatant. Naomi, you're an enemy combatant. And it doesn't matter that we're innocent American citizens. They can take us from this studio when I walk out the door to a 10 by 12 foot cell in a Navy brig and leave us there for 3 years in solitary confinement, making it hard for us to talk to our lawyers, see our family, get charges filed. So they can't torture us yet, but psychiatrists know that 3 years in isolation will make sane people insane. That's what happened to Jose Padilla. And it doesn't matter that we're innocent. It's a status offense. He could just say it. It's like, Mother May I. Mike, you're an enemy combatant, and that's it. So that is really scary. And the way democracies close down is not in a gradual sort of diagonal line. It's a series of tipping points. So the day that we legalized torture with the 2007 Military Commissions Act was one vertical line in that set of tipping points. The day the kid got tasered in Florida, I see that as another tipping point because the blueprint is predictive, and you're going to start to see more and more Americans getting hurt when they exercise free speech or dissent. The day that someone I identify with, an editor, a journalist, an activist, gets named as an enemy combatant, that's the day I stop talking. And that's how democracies close down. It doesn't take a coup. It takes a handful of arrests at this stage of people that ordinary people identify with, abusive arrests, for people to just go quiet because, torture changes everything. Physical abuse changes everything. The third thing, if you can stand it, that would-be dictator does is creates a paramilitary force not answerable to the people. And when I say this, everyone says, what? Blackwater, right? So Blackwater's in the news right now for massacring 17 Iraqi civilians in cold blood. Blackwater operates totally outside the rule of law in Iraq because of Paul Bremer's Order 17. And today's New York Times reported that the State Department is protecting Blackwater from being investigated by the FBI and the Iraqi government. So why is this so damn frightening, such bad news for us? You can't close down a democracy without a paramilitary force. Mussolini used the black shirts. Well, Italy was still a democracy. Hitler used the brown shirts. Well, Germany was still a democracy. These are sort of thugs who roam the streets and intimidate civilians. But with a paramilitary force, you can close down a democracy, even with all the institutions of civil society still functioning. So, because people get scared. So most of us don't know that Blackwater is already operating in the United States. They were deployed by Department of Homeland Security in New Orleans in the wake of Katrina, and Jeremy Scahill reports that contractors did shoot at civilians. Something I need to investigate is that an old woman was reportedly tasered to death in a wheelchair. I need to find out more about that in Iraq. In New Orleans. But their business model, they just got $1 billion contract to expand their operations, including here at home. $1 billion. And they have close ties to the White House. So their business model calls for greater and greater deployment in the United States in the event of a natural disaster or a quote-unquote public emergency. And a new law, the 2007 Defense Authorization Act, gives the president alone, unilaterally, the power to declare a public emergency. So tomorrow, legally right now, tomorrow we could wake up and see Blackwater guarding the State House, or Blackwater harassing or intimidating anti-war activists or voter registration groups, or Blackwater, menacing Congress people. And there is nothing legally we can do to prevent that right now. And, the founders, what is the Second Amendment? the founders knew how intimidating it is to civilians to have a standing army that's not answerable to the people, because King George's mercenaries were harassing the colonists, breaking into their homes, raping women, going through their stuff, you know. That's why we have the Second Amendment that says you can't have a standing army that's not answerable to the people. And that's why we have the Fourth Amendment that says the state can't break into your home and take your stuff. And what Blackwater and the warrantless wiretapping has done is kind of gut both of those protections so that we could find ourselves looking at mercenary forces outside our door. We could have the state, you know, come home and find out that our kids' stuff has been gone through by agents of the state. Exactly what the founders were afraid of. And the last thing I'll mention, I know it's a real freak out. The last thing I'll mention is step 4 is create a surveillance apparatus aimed at ordinary citizens. And, you know, what you saw in East Germany is the state doesn't have to even have a file on a majority of people for dissent to close down. Only 10% of East Germans actually had a file kept by the Stasi, but everyone thought they had a Stasi file. And that silences people. I mean, I've got this whole section on the watch list, the TSA watch list, and surveillance has gotten to the point where when you get on a plane, the Washington Post reports, you know, the TSA knows what you have brought on board to read, who your seatmate is, where you're going when you get off the plane, and the phone number of the people you're going to go visit. And you know, you can sort of think, well, okay, whatever, but the reports I'm getting from around the country of TSA being on the list, and I'm on the list, or I was for a year and a half, and I reported this out, and dozens of critics, activists, anti-war activists, constitutional scholars are on the list. It's not just about searching anymore. There are more and more reports coming in of harassment, intimidation. This one Mills College professor was taken out of line, taken to an interrogation cell. Most of us don't know there are now interrogation cells in U.S. airports. And she was told that if she moved, it would be considered assault against her interrogator. And she was just sent to Turkey, you know, not allowed to go home, get her stuff, say goodbye to her students. You know, Maher Arara Yuppie from Canada, a software engineer, it's a guy like you and me, you know, father of 2, was taken to an interrogation cell in Kennedy, not allowed to call his lawyer, and shipped off to Syria to be tortured. So it's not so, you know, funny anymore to be on the list or you know, at that level of surveillance. And the rest of the 6 steps are just as disturbing. And, you know, we have a crisis and we have to act now.
I know that in addition to all the mercenary for hire organizations like Blackwater, there's also been the weakening of the Posse Comitatus Act.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. Number 10, the last stage of what I call a fascist shift, is the declaration of martial law or the subversion of the rule of law. There are different ways to do this. And the last chapter of The End in America plays out a series of what-ifs that could easily take place based on the historical blueprint in the months running up to the 2008 election. And history shows that the months before national election in a weakening democracy are the most unstable and the most likely to see, they're called agents, I always get the accent wrong, but I don't speak French, but agents provocateurs, you know, agents of the state who are kind of sent out. And we have a history of this. The FBI did this in the 70s with COINTELPRO, dressed like people like you and me, but their job is to create instability, to engage in acts of violence, to turn a peaceful march into a violent march, to create a provocation that justifies a crackdown, a curfew, martial law, or a state of public emergency. And yeah, the 2007 Defense Authorization Act unbelievably gave the president the power to federalize the National Guard. Again, total violation of the Second Amendment. And what that means is that he can call the National Guard of Alabama to come crack down on us here in Washington, and he can do that over the objections of the governor of Alabama and the governor of Washington, and he doesn't have to tell Congress he's done it till after the fact. So since I know now from my reading the historical blueprint for closing down an open society, I was saddened but not at all surprised to learn, and this got almost no traction in the media, that apparently the White House had planned a dirty bomb exercise in 3 U.S. cities, including Portland, Oregon, for next week, October 15th to 19th, and Congress wasn't informed. So, this kind of thing you see in a destabilized democracy where a would-be despot is cracking down and basically, I don't know how to say this any more clearly. Basically closing down democracy. Or trying to.
We actually had one of those previous tests was here in Seattle, one of those dry runs that they had here in Seattle.
What was that like?
It didn't get a lot of media play. It got a bit more because it was going to be a traffic problem, But I know that Congress still hasn't. They were just asking for it the other day. They were still asking for the report from that, and that happened 2 years ago, and they can't get the report.
They can't get the report. So this is a very important. There's this very dangerous lag time when a democracy is being closed down, when people are still in denial. Understandably, who wants to believe this is happening? It's very kind of infantile thinking in a way. It's very much like in an abusive household where no one wants to say the daddy could have hurt the children, right? You just don't want to see what you're seeing. But it's a dangerous time because what happens at a certain point is that the leaders are just no longer engaged in democracy, but Parliament still keeps trying to do the dance of democracy, and the people keep trying to do the dance of democracy, and that's where we are right now. Bush is just like whatever to Congress. You want to subpoena the emails, whatever. You want to see the plans to close down 3 American cities, whatever. I'll take. I'm going to issue signing statements, whatever. I'm going to veto it, whatever. And Congress keeps acting like, surely not. And that's why I think it's very naive for people to assume that the presidential election will unfold in the great pageant of democracy, because if these people are willing to subvert democracy so aggressively in so many extraordinary ways, is it common sense to think that they'll just say, okay, you know what? We lost. We're going home now. What is more likely to happen is, in a weakening democracy, the cabal in power basically has a corrupted election, and there are many ways to corrupt an election. And a new guy is a nominal head, and clearly Giuliani is the one who's been singled out to be that new guy. But it's basically the same people in power, and it's not really a pendulum swinging. It's not really liberty. Most people don't realize that closed societies continue to have elections, and they have newspapers and they have judiciaries. What they don't have is liberty. In fact, despots love having elections. They have elections all the time, and they have newspapers. And, I talk to Latin American journalists, and they're like so clear on the difference between putting out a paper in a closed society and in a democracy. It's the same newspaper, but they know in a closed society, you know where to stop. In a corrupted election, you know what the outcome is going to be. In a closed society, the judge knows what ruling will put him in jail and what won't. So, it's very, very bad that the president now has the power to federalize the National Guard. And what you have to ask yourself is why? Why go to this trouble to engage in all this legislation, making it possible to torture people, to strip people of due process, to subvert the rule of law? These are not short-term tactical decisions. These are systemic, long-term alterations of our essential landscape that essentially make it possible to have a dictatorship in America. Not in some crazy future, but tomorrow, if certain things happen and play out that are very plausible. And I would say, if we're getting to the point where Congress just basically has no effective power to do anything, we're already essentially there. And it's time to kind of rise up in a democracy movement to restore the rule of law very aggressively, very combatively. We're in a war. But I guess what is so ironic is that all over the world, we've gotten so complacent about democracy in this country after 200 years of a strong democracy. We sort of think it'll naturally protect us and we don't have to do anything about it. But democracy activists all over the world are looking at this and waving their hands no, these are classic signs. No, you don't give the leader power to put someone in prison for 3 years and, in isolation. No, you don't make it easier to declare martial law. No, you don't, let them replace the civil service with their cronies. I mean, that's a Goebbels tactic. In April of 1933, he cleared out the civil service and focused especially on lawyers and judges. And that's what we saw with the would-be purge of the U.S. attorneys. They were going to purge all the U.S. attorneys. If they had done that, it would already be the end of America, because in a close election, it's the U.S. attorneys who prosecute voter registration groups, and so on. I mean, we're seeing people being put in prison in Alabama for, donating to the Democratic Party. So it's very bad, and the time to wake up is now.
All right, so final question. If Congress has really become disempowered at this point, and we can't expect anything from them, and we can't expect much from the democratic process anymore, then what are you recommending citizens to do?
Yeah, that's the question, and it's the important one. The window is closing, but it is not closed. And now is a moment when we have the power. We don't have much time. Every day counts, really, to rise up by the millions in a grassroots democracy movement to restore the rule of law and to hold these criminals accountable. And I say that very measuredly. The first thing we've got to do is pass this 10-point legislative package. If you go to AmericanFreedomCampaign.org, it's this new organization we founded. It's now got partner members. It's got 5 million members if you add up all the partner organizations. And they're besieging Congress to pass this 10-point legislative package that would do things like restore habeas corpus, protect journalists from prosecution under the Espionage Act, forbid warrantless wiretapping. So if we pass that, and Congress is disempowered partly because people are apathetic. If 20 million people harass and confront Congress, it emboldens Congress to take action. They've told us that they want to stand up for liberty, but they're afraid of being seen as soft on terror. So the American people have to rise up and speak. The next thing we have to understand is how a democracy movement works. It's time for things like national strikes for the Constitution, bring everything to a halt. Look at how democracy movements have worked overseas, bringing down the Berlin Wall with people power. I mean, millions of people marching for their rights have great power to confront abusers. We're also seeing the individual power of conscience. I mean, Jimmy Carter just came out against torture. Bruce Springsteen just came out against torture. Tuesday night, I'm going to an event where Reese Witherspoon and Meryl Streep are coming out against rendition. Admiral Comey just basically said no, that history would make the people who are torturing detainees be ashamed. He peeled off from the administration. So when you start to see people standing up and saying no, you start to have a lot of individual judges are saying no. I don't know if you've noticed. So there's this shift in awareness when people start to realize that criminals are at the helm, and individual acts of individual conscience make a huge difference. I mean, Richard Evans, who was a scholar of the Nazi movement, said that there was a moment in 31, 32 when if, individual Germans had stood up and said no, history would have turned out very differently. And we're at that moment. And the last thing, I never thought I would say this. When I began this journey, I thought legislation was enough, and I thought that impeachment would be horribly divisive, and I would never call for it because it so rips up the fabric of continuity. It is clear that there are violent criminals at the helm of the state, and that we are in for a terrible trauma. I mean, unimaginable trauma if we don't confront them. And history shows that it's not enough to get people like that out of power. You have to prosecute them and get them behind bars. And I think a principled examination of what constitutes treason and how do you appoint a special prosecutor to investigate treason, crimes against the state, is necessary right now. We're in a terribly dangerous moment. The good news is that when millions of people rise up and confront would-be tyrants, would-be tyrants are often bullies, and bullies are often cowards. And history shows that when millions of people confront them, they back down. So the time is now to restore the founder's vision and save the country.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So I want to thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you.
We have just been talking with Naomi Wolf. She is the author of the new book, The End of America, letter of warning to a young patriot. And again, you can find out more information at the website AmericanFreedomCampaign.org.